It is 636 CE, and the fighting at Qadisiyyah has already turned into a nightmare. Across the Iraqi plain, the armies of the Rashidun Caliphate are facing one of the great military powers of the age, the Sassanid Persian Empire. The Arabs know cavalry warfare. They know speed, sudden movement, aggressive charges, and the violence of close combat. There was one weapon the horses had not been taught to face. It changed the way cavalry behaved: elephants. The Persian war elephants are not simply large animals placed in front of an army. They are moving fortresses. Their smell terrifies Arab horses before riders can get close. Cavalry formations lose cohesion. Riders struggle to control mounts that suddenly care nothing about discipline. Persian soldiers follow the elephants, ready to exploit every opening they make. Then the infantry begins to give ground. Once that process starts, retreat is only the beginning. A broken formation can become a slaughter. Someone had to force the men to stop thinking about escape. A huge warrior moves forward. He is old for men fighting in the front rank. Heavy mail covers his body. He holds a sword famous enough to have its own name, Du al-Nun. Instead of backing away from the elephants, he advances toward them. Then he begins reciting poetry. His voice rises through the confusion of animals, metal, dust, shouting, and death. This is not theater for its own sake. The men behind him are watching. If one warrior is willing to approach a Persian elephant on foot, then everyone else suddenly has fewer excuses to run. His personal courage becomes a weapon affecting hundreds of men around him. And there is another reason the scene matters. 2 years earlier, a Muslim commander had tried something dangerously similar against Persian elephants. It killed him. Before Qadisiyyah began, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas had sent word back to Medina asking for additional troops. The Persian forces gathering against him were enormous, and Iraq had already demonstrated how costly a defeat could be. Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab answered with a message that sounded almost absurd as military arithmetic. He was sending 2 men. But according to the tradition preserved in the account, Umar regarded those 2 warriors as equivalent to 2,000 soldiers. One of them was Tulayha. The other was the man now walking toward the Persian elephants, Amr ibn Ma'di Yakrib. To understand why anyone could describe a single man as 1,000 soldiers, Qadisiyyah is the wrong place to begin. You have to go south, into Yemen, almost a century earlier. Amr was born around 544 CE among the Zabid, connected to the great tribal world of southern Arabia. His father was a chieftain, but Amr entered a country where tribal lineage existed beneath a much larger political reality. Yemen was under foreign domination. Across the Red Sea, the Christian kingdom of Aksum had projected its power into Arabia. Ethiopian rule had become a fact of life in the Yemeni highlands. One of the best-known figures associated with that period was Abraha, the ruler remembered for the expedition involving elephants against Mecca and associated in Islamic memory with Surah al-Fil. For Amr, this was not remote history. He grew up in the world shaped by that occupation. Later tradition even connects him with memories of the old fortifications from Abraha's period. The empire was not something described by grandfathers around a fire. Its remains were part of the country around him. Resistance eventually produced another foreign intervention. A Himyarite noble, Sif ibn Di Yazan, sought help against Aksumite rule and found a powerful sponsor in Sassanid Persia. The Persians sent a comparatively small force under Wariz. Against expectations, the operation succeeded. Aksumite power in Yemen was broken, but the result was not lasting independence. Saif was later assassinated. Conflict resumed. The Ethiopians attempted to recover their position, and Yemen entered another period of struggle. Persian-backed resistance eventually held, and Persian influence became dominant. The country moved from one imperial arrangement into another, with Persian soldiers and officials forming part of the new political order. Amr appears in the tradition among the tribal leaders involved in this environment of resistance. That matters because his first lessons about power came long before the Islamic conquests. He had watched a stronger occupying system collapse. A smaller, determined force arrived at precisely the right moment. He had seen local politics, tribal interests, foreign armies, rebellion, and imperial strategy collide in his own homeland. Decades later, when he stood against armies that looked overwhelmingly superior on paper, that experience would not have seemed theoretical. Before Islam transformed Arabia, however, Amr had already become famous for another reason: war. The Arabian Peninsula of his youth was a world in which tribal raiding, feuds, reputation, courage, and poetry could all belong to the same man. Amr excelled in that environment. He became known as a formidable fighter, particularly in mounted combat, but his reputation did not rest on strength alone. For a time, the account places him in the court of the Lakhmid king Al-Nu'man, where skill with language mattered almost as much as skill with a blade. Before distant armies knew Amr as a battlefield figure, elite circles already knew his name through verse. That mixture of poetry and violence followed him throughout his life. Stories placed him beside some of the great warrior figures remembered in Arabic tradition. He fought men whose names survived in poetry and legend. One episode describes a night raid against Hawazin, in which Amr encountered a rider whose identity he could not make out in the darkness. There was no time for introductions. The two fought first. Amr gained the advantage, pulled the other warrior from his horse, and only afterward discovered whom he had defeated. The man was his own sister's son. Instead of killing him, Amr let him leave. The encounter became another part of the reputation building around him. Ruthless in battle, but operating according to an internal code that even warfare did not entirely erase. A similar tradition surrounds a duel with a young Kinana warrior. Amr knocked him from his horse, but saw that the man was standing alone while others escaped. Rather than finish him, Amr reportedly spared him because he respected the courage involved. It tells us something different. Reputation depended not only on winning. A celebrated warrior was expected to understand what courage looked like even when it belonged to an enemy. Naturally, a man with this kind of reputation accumulated stories that moved beyond history into legend. Some poems even claimed Amr had killed 2 lionesses. There is no reason to treat that as a secure historical event. It belongs to the mythology that gathers around famous fighters. But legends have value of another kind. They tell us what people believed a man was capable of. By the time Islam entered Amr's world, Arabia already regarded him as dangerous. His swords became part of that identity. Several names were attached to weapons he was said to have carried, but Du al-Nun became especially connected with his later campaigns. When Amr rode into battle calling out his own verses and invoking his blade by name, he was doing more than expressing confidence. He was reminding everyone listening exactly who had arrived. Eventually, the new movement spreading from the Hejaz reached southern Arabia. Amr traveled north and accepted Islam during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. For the emerging Muslim community, a man of his stature was a major addition. He brought personal prestige, fighting experience, and influence among tribes that already knew his reputation. But Arabia's political order was changing faster than old loyalties could adjust. In 632 CE, the Prophet died. Across much of the peninsula, agreements made with Medina began to fracture. Some tribes rejected political obligations. Others withheld zakat. New prophetic claimants emerged. Alliances shifted, and disputes that had been contained while Muhammad lived returned with force. The Rida Wars followed. Amr did not remain safely outside that conflict. He returned to the politics of Yemen and became involved with his nephew Qais ibn Makshu. According to the source account, their rebellion went beyond refusing an order. Men connected with their faction killed 3 representatives associated with the caliphate. Whatever prestige Amr possessed, Abu Bakr now had a rebellion to suppress. Forces were sent into Yemen. The coalition opposing Medina fractured, undermined in part by the same tribal divisions that had brought its members together. Amr was captured. The warrior whose name had frightened men across Arabia was placed in chains and taken north across the desert to Medina. It should have been the end. By the political standards of the period, he had given the new state ample reason to execute him. He had once pledged himself to Islam. He had later joined the rebellion and now stood as a defeated captive before the caliph. Instead, Abu Bakr gave him another possibility. Return sincerely. Renew your allegiance. Live. Amr accepted. That moment changed the direction of everything that followed. His past was not erased. When Umar later became caliph, he imposed a strict limitation on former participants in the Rida uprisings. Men who had rebelled could fight for the caliphate, but they would not be trusted with major independent commands. For someone like Amr, that restriction could have been unbearable. He had been a tribal leader. He had commanded men before many of the younger officers around him had built reputations of their own. He was famous before some of them were born. Now he was expected to serve as an ordinary warrior. He accepted it. That decision defines the second half of his life. Amr did not rebuild his place by demanding that people forget what he had done. He went to the frontiers and fought for the same political order he had once resisted. He went first towards Syria. There, the Rashidun forces were confronting the Byzantine Empire. Commanders such as Khalid ibn al-Walid and Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah had little difficulty recognizing Amr's value. Even without high command, a warrior with his reputation could change the behavior of troops simply by standing among them. That became especially important at Yarmouk in 636 CE. The Byzantine field army had gathered for an enormous attempt to stop the Muslim advance in Syria. Traditional figures for the armies vary and are likely magnified, but the narrative presents a clear reality. The Muslims believed themselves confronted by a substantially larger imperial force. Amr fought on the right, among Yemeni tribesmen who would face some of the hardest pressure of the battle. Before the formations fully collided, champions entered the space between the armies for individual combat. This was al-Mubaraza, duels intended to test nerve before mass battle began. Amr stepped forward. The source describes him meeting a heavily protected Byzantine warrior. Rather than fighting cautiously, Amr closed aggressively and caught the man's shield. He pulled him off balance and struck through his defenses with Du al-Nun. The fallen warrior's equipment was taken in view of the opposing army. Whether every detail grew in the telling is less important than the role the episode plays in the larger story. Amr was being used as a psychological weapon. Then came the real battle. On one of Yarmouk's worst days, the right side of the Muslim army came under intense pressure. It was driven backward toward its camp. A collapse on a flank could expose the entire formation. Amr, fighting on foot, held his ground at the threatened point. He had no need to issue elaborate commands. The tribesmen could see him. The famous warrior who had once rebelled against Medina was now standing in the position from which other men were tempted to escape. The line held. Yarmouk ended in a decisive Rashidun victory and shattered Byzantine hopes of restoring control over much of Syria. Yet the campaign took something from Amr that decades of combat had failed to claim: his eye. Not, according to this account, from a sword, not from an arrow, not during one of the duels that made him famous. Disease did it. Smallpox spread through the camp, and Amr lost an eye. There is something fittingly human about that detail. A man could survive years of raiding, cavalry fighting, dueling, rebellion, capture, and one of the largest battles of his era, only to be permanently marked by an illness indifferent to reputation. But he kept fighting. With Byzantine resistance weakened, Muslim forces continued reducing fortified positions in Syria. One such operation centered on a heavily defended fortress, identified in the account as Aristan. It was in the region of Homs. A conventional assault promised heavy losses. A prolonged siege would consume time. Instead, Abu Ubaidah chose a small group of elite fighters. Roughly 20 men were selected. Amr was among them, and the feared Dirar ibn al-Azwar was also part of the operation. The surviving stories agree more confidently on the purpose than on the precise method used to enter the city. One version describes the men being concealed among supplies or inside containers and carried beyond the defenses. The exact staging is uncertain. The essential point is that a tiny group penetrated the fortress and waited until darkness. Then they moved toward the gate. Their greatest advantage was confusion. A garrison, hearing fighting inside its supposedly secure walls, had no immediate way of knowing whether 20 men had entered or 2,000. In darkness, fear fills the gaps that information cannot. Amr and the others fought toward the entrance and overwhelmed the guards. They opened the gates. The army outside entered. A fortress that might have required a long investment was compromised from within in a single night. But Syria was not where the greater crisis was developing. To the east, Persia was preparing for another confrontation, and Iraq had already learned what Persian elephants could do. In 634 CE, before Amr reached Qadisiyyah, a Muslim army under Abu Ubaid al-Thaqafi had confronted Sassanid forces near the Euphrates at the Battle of the Bridge. The Persians brought elephants. The Arab horses panicked. Abu Ubaid attempted to neutralize the largest animal by getting close enough to cut the straps securing the fighting platform on its back. The idea itself made sense. Remove the platform, dislodge the soldiers riding above, and the elephant becomes far less useful as a battlefield system. But Abu Ubaid did not finish the attempt. The animal seized or knocked him down and trampled him. His death helped trigger disaster. The Muslim formation collapsed and suffered one of its worst defeats of the Persian War. That memory was still fresh when the armies met again at Qadisiyyah. This is why Umar's claim that Amr and Tulayha were worth 1,000 men each carried such weight. The Iraqi army did not merely need additional bodies. It needed men who could make frightened soldiers believe the elephants could be stopped. By the time Amr arrived, negotiations with the Sassanid commander Rustam had failed. Envoys had crossed between the camps. Terms had been discussed. Rustam delayed while waiting for a better strategic position. It ended with battle. Later traditions exaggerated Amr's age, sometimes making him extraordinarily old. Whatever the precise number, the source emphasizes that he was already among the older warriors taking part. And yet, he moved toward the worst part of the field. During the opening phases, the elephants disrupted Muslim cavalry and battered infantry formations. Persian troops used them to create holes through which conventional forces could attack. The answer was terrifyingly simple. Get close. Attack the equipment attached to the elephants. Cut the heavy straps supporting the wooden towers and bring the Persian archers down. It was almost exactly the kind of action that had killed Abu Ubaid 2 years earlier. Tradition places Amr among the warriors who attempted it anyway. He closed with the animals through the dust and confusion. He helped attack the harnesses, while the infantry struggled to keep its formation intact. And throughout the fighting, he continued reciting battle poetry. The poetry mattered because people could hear him. A familiar voice in chaos was proof that Amr was still alive. If the old warrior had reached the elephants and had not fallen, then they were not invincible. The psychological spell began to break. Qadisiyyah ended in Rashidun victory. Amr was reportedly awarded 2,000 dirhams for his service, a major reward. Yet the system still gave first place to the Quran's memorizers, even over famous warriors, in its distribution of honors. Amr accepted his place. The army advanced. Ctesiphon fell. Persian forces withdrew farther east and established another formidable defensive position at Jalula. It was protected by trenches and caltrops. Again, a direct attack was difficult. Again, a small force moved in darkness. A night operation targeted the crucial wooden bridge over the Persian defenses. Amr was included among the fighters involved. Tradition also places other former Ridda rebels in the action beside him. That gives the scene significance beyond tactics. Men who had once fought against Medina were now risking their lives together for it. At the bridge, they created the opening the main army needed. Persian defenders were attacked from an unexpected direction. Their defensive order began to fail, and Rashidun forces crossed. Jalula fell. But the Sassanid Empire still had one great army left. Persian forces gathered again at Nahavand in the Zagros region. Traditional accounts give enormous numbers, but whatever the exact size, Muslim chroniclers remembered the battle as one of the decisive encounters of the conquest. They called it the victory of victories. Al-Nu'man ibn Muqarrin commanded the Rashidun army. The Persians had learned from earlier defeats. Rather than expose themselves immediately in open country, they remained behind fortified positions and forced their enemies to come to them. For days, the Muslim army could not obtain the battle it wanted. Then came deception. A retreat was staged. The movement appeared disorderly enough to persuade the Persian army that its enemy was withdrawing. Sassanid troops left their prepared defenses and pursued. Once they were committed to open ground, the retreat ended. The Rashidun force turned. The battle became catastrophic for the Persian army. Somewhere in the fighting around Nahavand, Amr ibn Ma'di Yakrib reached the end of his life. The traditions disagree about the exact location. Some place his death directly in the battle, advancing into the Persian lines. Others connect it with fighting soon afterward, as surviving Sassanid forces were pursued toward places such as Ray or Qum. But the broad picture remains the same. He died moving forward. Consider the distance between the beginning and the end of that life. He was born in a Yemen, shaped by foreign occupation, and grew up watching imperial rule challenged by a smaller force. Before Islam, he became one of Arabia's celebrated fighters and warrior poets. His reputation was already surrounded by stories larger than ordinary life. Then he converted. Then he rebelled. He stood against the state he had joined and was defeated. Captured and chained, he was taken to Medina with every reason to believe his story was finished. Instead, Abu Bakr spared him. That pardon did not restore his old status. Umar would not allow men with his record to command armies. So Amr did something harder than demanding forgiveness. He lived with the consequences. He went to war as a soldier. In Syria, He fought the Byzantines at Yarmouk and stood his ground when a flank threatened to collapse. Disease took one of his eyes, but not his willingness to continue. He entered a fortress with a tiny group of men and helped open it from within. Then he crossed into Iraq, where the Sassanids had already destroyed one Muslim army with war elephants. At Qadisiyyah, he walked toward those same animals and helped turn a weapon of terror into something that could be attacked. At Jalula, he fought at a bridge in darkness beside men who, like him, carried the memory of rebellion. Finally, he reached Nahavand. He took part in the battle that broke the remaining military power of an empire that had dominated the region for centuries. The irony is difficult to miss. As a young man, Amr had lived through a struggle in which Persian intervention helped remove Aksumite domination from Yemen. Near the end of his life, he fought in the armies that dismantled Persian power itself. Empires had framed his entire existence. But perhaps the most important struggle in his story was smaller and more personal. It began in chains in Medina. From that point forward, every campaign became another answer to the question raised by Abu Bakr's mercy. Had sparing this man been a mistake? Amr spent the rest of his life answering no. Centuries later, tribal groups in Iraq would still trace ancestry back to him. His historical biography became inseparable from poetry, military memory, tribal genealogy, and legend. That is why Umar's extraordinary description endured. One man worth 1,000. Not because Amr could physically perform the work of 1,000 soldiers. Because on certain battlefields, numbers are not the only thing that determines whether an army survives. Sometimes a formation needs one man who refuses to move backward. One man whose reputation makes frightened soldiers ashamed to abandon him. One man willing to approach the weapon everyone else has already decided cannot be faced. Amr ibn Ma'di Yakrib had been famous before the rise of the Caliphate. He had been a warrior, a poet, a tribal chieftain, a rebel, and a prisoner. But the final part of his life gave that old reputation an entirely different meaning. The warrior Arabia had feared before Islam became the soldier the new Islamic State sent toward the places other men were most afraid to go.